in the National High School Journalism Convention experience. My name is Megan, and I advise the Orange and Black News Magazine and the Tiger Yearbook at Grand Junction High School in Grand Junction, Colorado. And I wanted to share with you today some tips to ease your editing burden. These tips could work for any publication, online, news magazine, newspaper, yearbook, anything like that. This is a process that my staffs have sometimes used over the years, sometimes not. But I find that when students do use this, it tends to help. So the overall idea here is that we really want to ease the burden, and we want to treat editing more like a coaching process and less like a process of just finding things right or wrong. So one philosophy I want you to adopt throughout this presentation and also throughout your work as a student is that perfect is the enemy of good. And what I mean by that is not that we don't want to strive for awesomeness and even perfection sometimes. We also don't want to ignore the fact that good work is good work. And sometimes good work is our best work, given the circumstance, given our technology, our software, our other aspects of our lives that are demanding. So we want to aim for perfection as student journalists because we know that our work matters, but don't let trying to be perfect, stop you from just really being proud of producing good work. So we want to make editing easier with fewer mistakes, and we want to sort of transfer some of this burden from you, the student leader, the student editor, maybe even the advisor, back onto the students who are doing the writing, because we want them to be as participatory in this as possible. We also want to create a process that works for your staff. This process is not one that every staff I've ever had uses. Sometimes staffs will tweak it. Sometimes I have a few students who are really great at using this process, and then other editors who adapt a slightly different one. So this is not the be all end all. I just propose it as something you could use to start to think of a process that gets everybody involved and that works for your staff. And then we also really want to think of the editing process as a way to teach, a way to coach, not just fix things. Because if you can teach and coach in the process, then you should be easing the burden as you go, so that editing 6 months into the school year looks a lot different than editing 6 days into the school year, because you've taught and you've coached how to make the product better from the get-go instead of just waiting until the end. So I like to think of the editing process as a combination of coaching writers through the process to make it better, and then also proofreading. So proofreading is more like those little line edits that you make at the end of the process when you're really ready to go to print, and they're not substantive changes. They're not changing the structure of the story or the sourcing or the interviews or anything like that. It's making sure there's no typos and that you have AP style and correct grammar. So you want to make the editing process a part of your larger goals as a staff. So don't try to solve every typo at once. And you want to think about how you can set reasonable, measurable goals. So those goals might be per issue, per web cycle, like how long you publish or how often you publish on the website. Maybe they're goals based on specific problem areas. So, really getting good at one AP style issue per month or per week. So you want to think about how you can take this process and really chunk it out into bite-sized pieces. So what we're going to look at here is a way to do some incremental coaching. So step-by-step coaching throughout the process. And this again is why I talk about the difference between really coaching writers through the process and then proofreading, which is what happens at the end. I think we've all been in places or scenarios where we just proofread, right? That frantic deadline, you're about to go to print, and everybody just read as much as you can and find the errors. And sometimes that happens, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. But if you can establish a process of coaching throughout the life cycle of a story, that end process won't be so terrible. So let's talk about coaching the rough draft. And when you first get a rough draft from a writer, it's really important to use structured questions to help them understand what they've done with the story and what the story still needs. So my first coaching tip is to ask the writer questions to identify a structure. So ideally, in a perfect world, you would be able to sit down with your writer as the student editor, as the editor-in-chief, as the advisor, and just ask them questions about what they've done with the story. Questions like, so tell me the 5 W's and the H in your story, and where can I see them? And then they'll walk through what they've done with the story. Ask them to tell you about the quotes. So why do you think this quote drives the story? Or why do you think this source is good to have as your very first source? You might ask something like, is your lead followed by a nut graph? Show me where the nut graph is. Or do you think the read hooks your readers? Why did you choose those details for the lead? The key with this conversation is really to get them to think about why they did certain things in their story. If they can't articulate their decisions, then they might still be pretty fuzzy about the purpose of the story, where the story needs to go, and the ultimate outcome of writing the story. So these things need to happen before proofreading. In this first initial conversation, don't look for typos. It's going to be really hard to sit back and just not mark the comma that's out of place or the quote formatting that needs to be adjusted. Just ask questions. Talk about what they've done with the story so that you establish how much they understand about their work. So for example, if this were a story that came in for a rough draft, and this is actually a real story that came in with my students, there are obviously some opportunities for proofreading. You can see Saturday is not capitalized. There's no AP style here. I want to avoid that as a coach and as an editor. Instead, I want to just ask them questions about the draft. So I might ask them certain questions like, for example, this is a story about Spirit Week. And the lead says that students and faculty are taking part in theme days with anticipation of homecoming. So I might ask, what details about Spirit Week do you think are missing from this story? And we might go through, what details do you have? What is Spirit Week? When is it? Who's participating? Why are they participating? How are people participating? Well, this story is missing the how. In other words, how do I participate? What are the theme days? The story doesn't tell me that. So in asking the writer those questions, they can go through their story, see what they've done, and hopefully identify that they're missing a key part of the story. So as I'm coaching, I would ask those questions. And I would look at things like this quote at the end. Some of the theme days are really cool, but then some of them are really stupid. And that quote stands out to me, right? How students think about this event is probably important to my student body. And this quote probably represents what some other people think. So I might ask my reporter, why do you think the student said that? How do you think we could find out more about what students think of this event and their reactions to it? Another question I might ask is what's your favorite part of this story? What in writing this story got you excited or made you feel like you were contributing something? If they don't have anything to add, or they don't have a response to that, and they're not really jazzed about their own story, that's also a sign that they should dig more. So if a student says nothing, nothing is my favorite part of this story, then I would probably coach them and encourage them to talk to some more students. So especially around quotes, things that they could dig in. So the student who says they'll participate on some days more than others, well, why? What have been the best theme days they've ever had? And how could we get the student body more invested? That might be a really worthwhile question for this story instead of just telling what Spirit Week is. So in this example, I'm going to kind of go through this story here. So this was about freshmen settling into their routines, but that the student parking lot and the crosswalk is like not that safe. And it says, for years, students have suffered fender benders, car tagging, hit and runs, and close encounters on this street. And so the question is, why has such a basic concept of student transportation turned into such an issue? And this story goes on to say that students are really cutting it close, trying to like beat the bell, get into the front of the line for their favorite lunch destination, and safety has really taken a back seat. So you could look at this and think, what questions could I ask to coach the writer? What questions do you think they could ask? Well, some ones that you might think about would be to encourage them to look at some data, right? And I want to show you what you shouldn't do right here. So if I first saw this story, I would not want to go in and just start replacing it with proofreading and line editing. Because again, we want to deal with the content of the story. We want to coach them through it, okay? So here is what fixing looks like, but I want you to teach from the start. Okay, so some questions that we could ask is, what specifically about the parking isn't working? Okay, so I always encourage editors, like, think of 3 questions that you want the reporter to deal with to move the story forward, to address making the story itself stronger. Another question would be, what's new? What's the same this year? Another question would be, can we find facts and figures to back up this story? So could we go to the administration and look at the difference in numbers between accidents, fender benders, car tagging, student tardies, anything to really quantify this story? So these would be the 3 questions that I would ask the reporter to work on for the next draft. Give them very specific guidance about what you want to see in that next draft. So we've asked these questions, and then I help them really visualize what that next draft will include. So here's 3 questions I have for you. And in the next draft, I will see specific quotes from students who have experienced problems. I'll see a diagram of the parking lot. I'll see the precise number of parking passes compared to the total number of spots in our parking lot. And I will see quotes or facts from administration about the number of accidents. These are the things that I'll see in the next draft. And this gives your reporter a starting point. Instead of just saying, this draft needs more information, go get it. Yikes. That's a really scary place to be in if you're a new reporter, even if you're an experienced reporter, okay? So I ask questions, and then I say specifically, here's what I want to see in the next draft. Then they revise, they resubmit a draft to you, and you might repeat the coaching process if there's still some pretty big holes, or because you're not letting perfect be the enemy of good, maybe you have a deadline, maybe the next draft is sufficient, and then you would move to that line editing or that proofreading. So when you get to the proofreading stage, where you're really looking for errors, typos, style issues, things like that, one thing I encourage my editors to do is, like, don't try to be the jack of all trades. So don't try to be an expert at everything. We try to identify our strengths and then play off of that. So we might know that a student is really great at comma splices, or one student is really excellent at formatting quotes. So we try to engage our expertise and all pitch in to edit instead of relying on one person to catch everything. Another way to do that would be for your staff, each production cycle, to pick 3 areas that you could focus on. Maybe it would be names. Are all names spelled correctly? Are all quotes formatted correctly? And are all commas in the right place? Okay, maybe it would be those 3 things. For that issue, or for that production cycle, you might aim for perfection in these 3 areas, and then you might aim for good in everywhere else. You might also decide to have a process where your draft or your components of your magazine or your issue or your yearbook go through 3 other people, and we call this 3 before me, as specific as can be, okay? Meaning maybe 3 other people have to read a draft before it ever gets to me, the advisor, or the editor-in-chief. You can kind of pick your 3, and you try to dial it down as specifically as possible. So maybe the section editor looks at names, and with names, specifically spelling and titles. Maybe the editor-in-chief is looking at quotes, but specifically they're looking at the transition to that quote and attribution. And then maybe another staffer is really great at commas, so they're looking for the comma that is out of place. The more you can dial this in, the more clear it's going to be to your staff about the process, and the more efficient they can be. If you just hand an article to another staffer and you say, edit the quotes, fix the quotes, they might not know what that means. So if you can dial it down really specifically to the aspect of quote formatting that you're looking for, then they can make sure they get it right. So now we're going to line edit, but I want to encourage you not to use Google Edits that just replaces things. I want to encourage you to use Google Suggestions. If you only just use the editing tool in Google Docs, then all a reporter or a writer has to do is go in and check that little checkbox to fix it, right? So they go to their article, they see you've made all these edits, and they're like, click, 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 accept, 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 accept. And they haven't learned anything. They might not even like process the edits that you're suggesting. So if you use suggestion mode in Google Docs, they actually have to interact with the edit or the suggestion, and they actually have to do it themselves. So that's a better way to, again, teach instead of just fix. Okay, so here, for example, in trying to coach, I'm gonna highlight something. And then I'm gonna leave a comment that says like, double check all the capitalizations. And I'm gonna highlight a couple examples. And depending on the level of the student, I might highlight all of them, but I'm probably only gonna highlight 60 or 70% so that they then have to go back into the story, re-engage, and try to fix it themselves. So this is a good way, again, to use like comments, suggestions, instead of that editing feature where all they have to do is just check the box, right? And then they might not be learning quite as much. So another thing you can think about in this editing process is like, how can you make it fun? Editing is usually a process that we don't think about from beginning to end. We really just kind of shove it at the end of our cycle, and that can make it really stressful. So by spreading it out through coaching before we ever get to proofreading, we have a lot of opportunities to make it more fun because we're not at that like max stress deadline point, right? So you might think about small prizes that you can give for somebody at the proofreading stage who finds the most errors. You might think about special privileges for students on your staff who reach like master proofreader level, right? Somebody who is great at maybe 3 or 4 different types of editing: AP style, commas, titles, quote formatting. Maybe it's the person who is excellent at the summary lead, or somebody who can always write a wonderful nut graph and is great at looking for those. These are ways that you can sort of reinforce that like, this is part of the process. It's not just like the last thing we do. It's always, right? It's the whole thing. You might decide to have a specific position on your staff that is writing coach, so that those people know their job is to coach from the very beginning. You might even consider changing your leadership titles from editor to editor and coach, just to reinforce like these things matter. And the more you can sort of ingrain it into your staff in fun ways and in ways that make them proud or that have to deal with titles or leadership positions, the more buy-in that you will probably get. So after you have done the whole process and you've published something, right? It's either been printed online, it's come out in hard copy, it's your yearbook. Don't forget to debrief, Okay, this is actually an editing stage that always needs to happen, even though there's nothing you can do about the errors at that point, unless it's online, and then you could always fix some things. That debrief is really, really critical, right? Because then you get to go back and you get to say, what worked, what didn't, how many errors did we have? You do want to quantify your process, like what is working and what isn't. So as we debrief after an issue, we go back and we have people do a proofreading. So every mark, typo that we wish we had caught, it's always humbling. That's okay. Then we also do a content debrief. So we look at those coaching questions and we see like, where did we miss an opportunity to coach to make this story better? And so we look at things like, oh, we missed like an opportunity for this lead to be really engaging. What could we have done better with this story? We also do like a design debrief. That's a whole other process. So it doesn't stop just because you published. You want to follow that process all the way through so that then you can say, hey, is what we're doing working? Or do we need to keep refining our editing and our coaching process to keep making our final result that much better? So I want to say thank you for following it through this far. These are just some suggestions for making your editing process better. They don't have to be applied to every staff in exactly the same way, but I would really encourage you to think about how you can turn your staff into coaches and editors, not just editors. How can you empower your reporter through coaching to go out and revise that story so that when they bring it back to you, they feel really good about their product because they know what you want, right? Through the coaching process, you've identified something for them to really specifically improve, and they know that they're going to make you happy by doing those things. This is going to help your team building. This is going to help their sense of contribution, and ultimately it'll make your product better, right? So feel free to get in touch with me. This is my Twitter handle as well as my email. If you have questions about this, I'd be happy to elaborate on the process, but I wanted to keep it as short as possible just to give you some ideas and to kind of plant the seed. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them my way. And thanks for joining us at the National High School Journalism Convention.